is Heather Schwartz. I'm a practice specialist at CASEL. Sort of a broad term, but basically just indicating that I come from teaching, and that's the perspective that I bring to every project I'm on. I started as a 7th grade language arts and social studies teacher, which I will talk about a little bit as we go. I'm hoping to do a lot of turn and talk because I'm here to learn from you as well. So I hope you'll indulge me and do our hands up signal, only because sometimes people get so engaged they don't really notice we're stopping. So if you can, once we do this, if you can help sort of remind people. So before we start, I just wanted to get a sense of who's in the room. So would you raise your hand if you are currently elementary school educator, high school educator, someone who has a program or teaches mindfulness, someone who has a mindfulness practice and was just interested, or you can raise your hand multiple times, parents who are interested in mindfulness. Okay, anything that I missed? Middle school. Of course I would miss that since that's what I taught. It's early childhood, thank you. Okay, so this should have social worker. Yes, I should have said that. So this should have a little something for everyone. So I want you to start just by imagining a student, either a student that you work with now or have worked with. It could be a neighbor, it could be the child of a family friend, and really get a picture of that student in your mind. So really see that student. Okay. I know some of you have. Some of you look very calm. Some of you look a little perplexed. This student, imagine it's about 15 years down the road, and you're at the supermarket, and you run into them, and you're just chatting and catching up. What do you need to know from them to feel like they've been successful? What do you need to hear from them to feel like they've been successful? So just think about that for a moment. And then I would love to hear some things, and you can, I think just shout them out is fine with this number. Or raise your hand if you like that. Yeah. They're happy. Yeah. Yeah.
They're moving forward.
They're moving forward. Whatever plans they have, they're moving towards it. Anything else?
Strong sense of self-identity.
Strong sense of self-identity. Yeah.
They feel like they belong.
They feel like they belong. Great. Okay. Yeah. And so our definition at CASEL of SEL is the process, very important word, the process through which children and adults acquire and effectively apply the knowledge, attitudes, and skills necessary to understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. So there are, I think, a lot of crossovers between what we say we want for kids and this sort of understanding of what a whole child education, what social emotional learning is. And so bear with me if this is all old news to you. I just wanted to ground us all on the same page. CASEL was founded in 1994, and our goal is to make SEL an integral part of education, K to 12. And the work that we do is to advance the science of SEL. So we have work groups that are getting together to work on assessment, people from the field coming together to talk about equity, to expand high quality practices. For that, we work with districts and do trainings, and we also have our program guide where we review programs, SEL programs, and then working with policies. We're really trying to come at this from an ecosystem perspective where we see the layers, right? You ask teachers to do something in the classroom, and whether or not they feel they have the capacity probably depends on the environment they find themselves in and the administrator. And the administrator, whether they feel they have the capacity to support the teachers, probably depends on their environment, and so on and so on. So we started more at the school level, and then we began working with districts, and now we're working with states. So there's compelling evidence that SEL is linked to student gains, specifically improved attitudes about themselves, feelings about school, feeling less emotional stress. And then there is the academic element too. So that I think is helpful to know when we get into conversations about time, because sometimes our talk can get kind of binary, where it's like, well, we don't have time for this because we need to do this, and just understanding the way these are integrated, I think, can help make the case. Now, in this room, we're probably the believers, but I imagine there's someone you've had to make the case to or might need to make the case to at some point, and this is good to know. It's also helpful for adults. We know that these social and emotional competencies can really help adults to stay in the classroom, feel less burnout, and also working in a school that has a positive and supportive ecology helps adults. So it's not just about a personal practice or what you do, but the context and the environment that you're doing it in. Yes.
How do you, I'm new to this.
Oh, good.
What metrics, or how do you find that you group students to know if they're doing better?
That's a
Like,
great
I mean,
question.
I see that they can show those students have gains, but
Yeah.
like, are there certain assessments that you give, or like, how do you make those judgments on if a student is in a good social emotional place?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So this particular set of evidence comes from a meta-analysis that they did where they were reviewing the effects of a bunch of SEL programs. But one of the resources that I have a link to is a new assessment guide that we have, and it's at CASEL. It's a free guide, and it was one of those projects where we brought national experts together because it's very tricky. You know, I mean, as people know, it's like, so brought people together to really talk about when you would assess and how and for what purpose, right? Is it for our growth as a school to understand how to support kids, or is it to, you know, separate, you know? And clearly we believe it's the first one. Is that a little glimmer to know that you're going to have access to that assessment blog? Because I know I'm not totally answering the question. It's just, there's a lot, and it's a really good question. So in this meta-analysis, meta-analysis in 2017, they did a second one, and one thing they found was that the impacts of social emotional learning were, they kept their impact over time. So even students who had access to these programs in kindergarten were still thriving later on. They had a higher academic performance, they had positive attitudes, positive social behaviors, less emotional distress. Again, this is based specifically on programs. I think that's important to call out. But there are a lot of other strategies that people are using that are more integrated. So again, getting back to teacher capacity to handle a super stressful job. Teachers with high levels of social competence can model behaviors for students, can manage stress. can develop relationships. That's really what this is about at the end of the day, is relationships. And then also just the perspective of parents. You know, when parents are thinking about their students, a lot of them are feeling concerned, and you probably already know this, that their students are stressed and not happy. And I think that this is really an opportunity for people who do social emotional learning and mindfulness kind of work, because this is a gift. This is something that can be offered that can help develop and nurture the whole child. So at CASEL, we use this framework, and just curious, does anyone use this in their work? Okay. So we talk about these competencies. Self-awareness and self-management are the more internal competencies. Social awareness, relationship skills have to do with how I interact with the world outside of me. And responsible decision-making is a little of all of it. And we also have these rings to indicate that it really matters that these happen, and we support students in all the layers of their lives. So working with them in classrooms, in schools, homes, and communities. We've recently had an equity work group that has been working to add an equity lens to these to ensure that when we're talking about these things, we're doing so in a way that honors and acknowledges that identity is, it's not a one-size-fit-all construct. And so within these different categories, there are sub-competencies. So for self-awareness, the ability to label and recognize emotions, recognizing strengths, sense of self-efficacy, all fall into that category. Self-management, and I think something that's really important to me about this is that, yes, it does involve impulse control, but it's so much broader than that. It includes the ability to set goals and to work towards your vision for what you want. So sometimes we see in schools, and it's understandable, having been a 7th grade teacher, that we get a little laser focused on the regulation, the self-regulation part of self-management. And the term sort of invites us to do that. I like to think of it as self-leadership, right? So that we think of it a little more holistically. World could use a little of this. Social awareness includes perspective taking, empathy, appreciating diversity, and respect for others. Anyone who teaches literature or social studies is probably naturally integrating strategies that do this. I think. Maybe I shouldn't assume that. I did. Relationship skills. So if you have the social awareness to understand someone's perspective, what do you do with it? Right? So the relationship skills, I think, are a little bit more demonstrable. In some ways, it's like, you know, the actual communication skill, the actual ability to work cooperatively, resolve conflicts, help, seek help. And the last one is responsible decision making. So identifying problems, analyzing potential steps, solutions, reflecting, evaluating, ethical responsibility. Something that I really like about these competencies is they're broad enough that a lot of things can fit into there, so it works for me as a framework. And also, you're just never done. Like in fact, I'm about to ask you to reflect on this, but I know for me, I can say competencies that I've been better at points in my life, that I've struggled with, that certain circumstances bring out the best in me. So I'd actually like you to, in a minute, when I say to go ahead and do this, you'll introduce yourself to someone sitting next to you. 3 is fine if that's how it works best. And then I'd just like you to reflect on one competency that you feel like you got down pretty well. We're always growing, but pretty good. And then one that you're really working on right now. And then we'll come back together in like maybe a minute and a half, just a short little. Okay, so go ahead, introduce yourself to someone. One competency you think you're doing pretty well with, one where you're like, yeah, I'm working on that. Feel free to insert yourself.
Oh, okay. In Chicago or
So what can you tell me about your conference in October? Is there going to be any scholarships or anything?
I don't know anything about
Because
that.
with all this stuff, it's a very school districts that have money.
Yeah.
Like money. Like I'm from Rochester, New York, and I teach, Rochester, New York is the third largest population of children living in poverty.
Yeah.
And so,
It's hard.
for me myself.
Right, you're already probably hemorrhaging money.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer. I'm sorry. I don't work on, I think they know, but I don't know because I don't work on it. But
They said in April.
I'll give you my email and then I can find out.
I looked at chapters. You're in Mindfulness.
I just did the training. I didn't like.
Did you do the year?
All right, let's come back together. Oh, thanks. Oh, this is so much better. I was picturing when I walked in and saw the whole room and I was like, I still want to get people talking, and I was just picturing myself just do it, Heather, you can do it. But this is a nice little group. Thank you. So is anyone feeling open and brave enough to share?
Ask you to either fix the mic or
Is it weird?
I can't, yeah.
Really? No, I'm glad you told me.
Old and white hair, The hearing tends to go. Yeah, if you put it.
When I look at the screen. That's okay, I'm not used to wearing a mic, so I
You want to use the hand mic instead?
I use the hand mic. That's better, because I'm looking at my screen, so I'm turning away from the, okay, thank you. So now I might ask you to do me a favor and be the first to share. No, you don't have to, I'm just kidding. Give me that mic. Okay, great. Oh, this is good too, actually, because now when people are sharing, we can use the mic. I'm going to do a talk show thing. Is anybody willing to share? Awesome.
As my mindfulness practice develops, I think that I am getting pretty good at identifying emotions and, knowing where I'm at and taking care of that piece. So I feel like that's, it's still an ongoing work, but pretty good.
Cool.
Something that Matt said about the time management piece really hit home. Not because I don't know what my priorities are, but I feel like everything's a priority.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've struggled with as I've developed passion for things, passion for being a mom, passion for my job and mindfulness, it's an ongoing struggle and I'm not doing well at it, is that wherever I am, I feel like I should be somewhere else. I'm here and this is awesome, but oh my gosh, I really wish I was here too. And that's a mindfulness thing, right? Being in the moment and being here. but it's an ongoing struggle. You know, I always feel like there's not enough time to do everything I want to do.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I have a feeling you're not alone. Yeah. We're getting some nods with that. Oh, I wish I was wearing my step tracker. Just kidding. Thank you.
Do I have to stand up?
No.
One thing that we kind of talked about was that, you know, we're self-aware, we're aware of our emotions, but then when you look at like the self-care piece and the, you know, the self-discipline and the time management and those kind of things, the motivation, we kind of were talking about how those things, you know, are naturally in us as teachers.
Yeah.
But because of stress and some of the things that you pile on your plates, those things kind of become depleted.
Yeah.
So that's something that's ongoing.
Yeah.
That I think at least we need to work on.
Yeah. I think that's a good point too, even within a competency, that there could be some parts of it that feel really natural and some parts that are a challenge. Anyone else feel like sharing? Okay. So I have a short video from a school called Marcus Garvey. Are any of you Chicago teachers? So this is a school that has really dedicated resources, time, staff, funding to SEL, and just a little glimpse of what it looks like, because I think sometimes it's a lot of talk and it can be hard to actually picture.
SEL means to me like social emotional learning, like
Is that
it
good
means
value?
to like talk to other people, like to be respected, be nice, like greetings or like saying hello, how are you, or your name. You can talk to them like about how you doing, like how you doing, like how you feeling. Like if they're sick, like you can say, how you doing, how you feeling? Like, can I cheer you up? Can I cheer you up? You need me to do something for you? Like the peace center, and like if we have a problem, like we go to the peace center and try to work it out and do our steps. We look at the board first, because we have like a board that tells the steps, and we try to work it out with calmness and patientness. Like we let each other talk first, and we make sure that we can work the problem out before it goes into any serious thing. And like we have this bottle. Like if you get really mad, you have to shake it, and then look at the glitter until you calm down, and then do your steps.
I really think that now we make the students take more responsibility for controlling and managing their behavior. So I'm a big self-manager, and so if I'm directing you on what you're supposed to do, that means that I now have to stop doing what I'm doing to make sure you're on task. When that's what it shouldn't be. I'm a facilitator, and therefore you're supposed to work independently. And I think now that that's where our kids are.
I want to read to you one of my favorite stories. And the character is that she reminds me of myself.
Today I did a read aloud, and that's one of my favorite books, but I've had that book for years. I probably share it with every class that I have. And I never really settled under the SEL lesson. It's just that it does teach skills about that. I think that self-awareness is one of the most important skills for kids to have.
Before we really started practicing SEL like that every day, we had, you know, different problems. Kids were teasing each other, talking about each other, that kind of thing. But now, it is really calmed down. It's really calm where we don't do that. You know, if somebody starts that teasing or that type of behavior, someone in the classroom will say, you know, that's not respectful. That's not being nice. That's not cool. That's how the kids talk. That's not cool. And so then it kind of just, without me even having to say anything, it stops.
When they come in at 3, they don't know where they are. They're crying. You know, that first 2 or 3 weeks is just dealing with the crying and giving them the feeling that they're safe.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning.
How is everybody today? Raise your hand if you're happy. Raise your hand if you're really happy.
So it's a lot of reading stories about feelings, talking about feelings like you saw today, just getting them getting them comfortable with, it's okay if you're sad, it's okay if you're angry, you know, let's talk about it, and just getting them to open up and to know that it's a safe place. So just, you know, reading stories, we do lots of picture journaling. I'll come in and we'll do circle time, and I'll tell them how I feel. And sometimes, you know, Miss Crump might not feel 100%, and I'll let them know that. But I always let them know that it's okay to feel a certain way. But when you act out, you know, that's not okay. So let's see a way we can feel that way and not lash out at other people.
And we will use our picture journals to illustrate and dictate today's feelings.
Kids come to school already with so many other issues. You know, even adults as well, but they come to school with so many other issues. And I think teaching them how to manage those emotions, that, you know, acting out because things aren't the way they need to be at home doesn't change what I need to do here. And I tell them all the time that education is the best way to change that.
I think in our investment for getting you ready for the real life and how getting ready for school, college, everything else.
Okay. So let's get back to this. That's not the current slide. Okay. Refresher. Oh, there we go. So I thought it also might be good before we move to the SEL connection to mindfulness to just get on the same page about definitions of mindfulness. So I think I'll take another moment to just turn to a partner and say what you think mindfulness is and how you would define it. And this will be a kind of a short one, I think. So go ahead and chat with the partner you've been speaking with. Start to finish up your sentence. Okay, let's come back together. Is there anybody who would like to share what they spoke about with their partner? Thank you.
We both said the same thing. We both said that it's just being present in the moment where you're at, knowing what you're feeling, and being where you are and thinking about what you're doing at that time.
Great. Anybody else have something to add to that?
Just the non-judgment component and constantly beginning again and being patient with yourself in the process.
Great. Okay. Yeah.
I usually always like to add with kindness and curiosity.
Yeah. Yeah, that curiosity part is hard sometimes for me. And how many of you are already using some type of mindfulness practice in your classroom or whatever setting you're in? Okay, so a lot of people are doing that. Great. So this is me. I don't know if you can tell. I feel very lucky that my beginning teaching experience happened to overlap with my beginning mindfulness experience just by chance. So I was going to a mindfulness group, and I remember we learned this: stop, be, look, see, just as a way to slow down and see what was really there. And so I started teaching 7th grade, and I literally felt like I was a bull. Like this is what I thought it was gonna be like, but I felt like I was just charging towards from red cape to red cape. Like I felt like I just didn't have the self-awareness to step back and see the whole picture. And I remember one day in particular, it was just like nobody was listening, no one was paying attention, I was trying my best, and then this overlap happened between these two separate spheres of my life, and I thought, stop, be, look, see. And that's when I noticed that, yes, Marissa was talking, and yes, Raul was trying to get a pencil, and yes, Mary was folding paper. Everybody else was basically on task and working and engaged. And I think that for me, that helped me address those students instead of doing what I had been doing in the beginning of my career, was just a global, you guys. And so that self-awareness and self-management was really a game changer for me. And as I taught, I started to incorporate other little things like a walking meditation when my students were working in collaborative groups. Obviously, I was trying to do it very subtly, but I really was trying to pay attention to my breath and my heel on the floor. And I think that that had a really big impact on my classroom, which was very calm. So at CASEL, we also see the intersection between mindfulness and social and emotional learning. We refer to mindfulness practices, everything in that category is mindful awareness practices. Just because there were different ways of talking about them in the field, this was what the team came up with, mindful awareness practices. And we see them as distinct and intersecting. So in many ways, we see MAPS as a deeper dive into a more narrow range of skills. So if you think about that definition of self-awareness, it included recognizing your emotions, which mindfulness, I think, can really help you do. But it also included things like working on your identity, and self-management also include, it does include the ability to pause, but it also included things like setting goals. So we see mindfulness as like a real activator for this particular part of the full picture. So here are the areas we thought intersected the most. Self-awareness, increased awareness of your inner emotional life, self-management, that improved self-regulation of your physiology, so really just being able to take the breaths, calm the heart, improved ability to focus and pay attention, and then social awareness, that mindfulness can increase empathy and compassion for others, especially if we're doing meditations or practices that focus on expanding our compassion for others and self. But we also thought that mindfulness could support all 5 competencies, really because we thought that mindful practices support learning. And social and emotional learning are part of the learning process. So being able to be present, to show up, to attend, it made sense that those would help. So how many of you have used or seen the program guide, the CASEL program guide? Okay. So I'll just say a little bit about it, since some of you already know. It's a consumer-style report that reviews evidence-based SEL programs. So if you were a school and you were looking for something, you could go to that guide and you could see their evidence criteria, they've been vetted, and then you could learn a little bit about the program itself. What does it focus on? What are the main strategies that it uses? We look at how well do they provide strategies that reach families and communities. So it's just sort of a way to help people who are trying to find a program to not have to go to all these different sources. And we have designations, so a select program. They address the full range. Those 5 competencies, we feel like they address them in a really robust way. The complementary programs address some of the competencies pretty fully, maybe not all 5. But in 2015, we looked at some educational practices that we thought, okay, these don't constitute SEL in themselves, in its entirety, but they really do provide opportunities for students to develop their social and emotional competencies. So we created this SEL-related category. And that included mindfulness, college and career readiness, and student-centered practices. Basically a way of saying, I think, we need to know more. We need to know more about these, but we haven't quite had the evidence come in yet at that point, but they're promising. They're promising, and it's not too hard to see how they do support social and emotional learning. Yeah?
What are student-centered practices?
Student-centered practices, sorry, let me just. Sorry, who asked the question? I'm like, student-centered practices, the way I understand them, are practices that really put the student, I'm trying not to use the definition, at the center, like focusing on their needs, responsive teaching practices. I don't know, anyone have any, I'm not fleshing that out very well.
Giving them greater agency.
Giving them,
in what the learning,
yeah.
social emotional learning is that's taking place.
Yeah, creating greater agency around what the SEL is that's taking place. Really using their voice as sort of what's the driver. Inquiry-based approaches, yeah. Yeah, project-based learning, all those things sort of go into that category. It's sort of the opposite of the sage on the stage approach. Yeah, workshop model. Thank you. Good team. So just if people are curious, these are programs that are already in the guide. So in SEL-related approaches, .B, Kripalu Yoga, Learning to Breathe, and Transformative Life Skills. Complementary and select programs include Pure Power and Mind Up. And the reason for that is that those programs include mindfulness practices and explicit SEL instruction. Do any of you use any of the programs up here in your schools? To some extent, yeah. But one thing I will say that I think is interesting, and I want to make sure I get the right number here. Maybe I didn't put in how many, but many of the programs that are not mindfulness programs explicitly, of the SEL programs, do use mindful practices, especially the pause. And whether they call it taking a meta moment or stop or pause, I think in a way that to me indicates there's sort of this implicit understanding that there is a role for mindfulness in SEL. So when we have programs that are teaching students how to make responsible decisions, they almost always start with that, which makes sense, right? Like you can know everything in the world about conflict resolution in terms of the things you should say, but if you get hijacked, it won't matter. Then again, just being able to pause might not be the full thing because you also want to have the communication skills to resolve the conflict. A lot of programs also use these mindful awareness practices in their self-management. So a lot of programs include belly breathing, taking deep breaths, centering exercises, and maybe don't call them out as being mindful practices, but they're there. Oh, I have another opportunity to talk. Where do you use a pause? Do you use a pause? If so, where do you use a pause in your daily work life? So go ahead and chat with a partner for a moment. Or where do you wish you used a pause? Feel free to insert yourself. Oh, your partner walked away. Ow. Just, there's a little window in there. Okay, so finish up your conversation. And then let's come back together, and I wonder if maybe this sharing will give someone else an idea they didn't have before. Is there a way that you've been able to use this pausing practice? And if not, that's okay. Yeah?
People don't share, so I'll do it.
Empathy.
Yeah.
It's what's for dinner.
I used to just eat and work through my lunch all the time. I was just, from the time I got to work, I started working, and then from the time I went, the kids left, I would continue working. And I started just taking my lunchtime, while I was eating, just to stop and eat my food and think and breathe and doodle and do nothing. I try to avoid going and scrolling on my phone and just sit, and kind of be at peace. And I will tell you that I have been more productive, and my afternoons have gone much better, much smoother since I started doing that.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Okay. So I was thinking, I think we do have time for a really short, mindful moment, just a quick body scan before we go into talking a little bit more about adult SEL and what we've learned. So if you'll indulge, not just me, but yourself, put your feet flat on the ground. You can take your shoulders up, back, and down. You can close your eyes, or if it feels more comfortable, you can just look at a spot on the floor. And so the first thing I'd like you to do is just squeeze your toes, scrunch your toes up as much as you can in your shoe, and then let them go. Then move up to your calves. Taking deep breaths, you can scrunch those up and let them go. To your thighs, tighten. Deep breath, let them go. Belly, tighten, let it go. Take your shoulders once more. You can scrunch them up towards your ears. Let them drop. And then for your head, maybe take one roll around. You can tighten your face, scrunch it up. Let it go. Take one or two more full breaths. And then come back into the space. Okay. How do you feel? Is that a nice little, okay. So one thing that we've learned from, CASEL has this collaborating district initiative where we work with districts all over the country. And they learn from us and we learn from them. And one thing that we've learned is that something that I think you all know here, because you've sort of talked about it in terms of mindfulness, but adult SEL matters, right? Our presence in the classroom, our ability to model is maybe one of the most important components that helps us create the positive environment. Mark Greenberg says, teachers with better emotion regulation are likely to reinforce positive student behavior and support students in managing their own negative emotions. And I think it makes sense if we think about the ways we said mindfulness practice practices can help sort of activate SEL for kids, that it would be the same for adults. So the same increased awareness of inner life, the same improved self-regulation, the improved empathy. I know for myself as a teacher, there were moments I really needed to be able to see a student that was really challenging and frankly bugging me with empathy and compassion. And I really needed to be able to stay aware of my own emotions when there was so much being asked of me and I was attending to so many other people. So one of my last questions, and I'm really curious, I don't think that we've actually done the work at CASEL to fully flesh this out because we haven't focused so much on mindfulness as much as SEL, but how might mindfulness strategies such as pausing help to prevent teacher burnout? I think we talked about that a little. And how might taking a pause, that slide has a problem. How might taking a pause can help teachers address discipline disparities and help do climate work? So I think this will be our last turn and talk, and I'd say just choose whichever of those questions is most interesting to you. You can go ahead and talk to your partner.
Something to recognize and realize that we're not our emotions.
Okay, start to finish up your conversation. All right, so let's come back together. Thank you for what is that? That's amazing. First it was like jazz music. Okay. Anybody willing to share? These are big questions, especially as we're working around equity, I think. Yeah, thank you. You don't have to stand.
Okay, because there's a lot of stuff on my list. So my question, my answer is that it gives us a moment before we, instead of being reactive or proactive about, you answered the second question about for that kid, but a question came up is how do we bridge the connection from everything that teachers are practicing today with mindfulness in the classroom with our kids to the home life? Like all of this stuff is always on the teachers and practices with the kids in the classroom, and we can do it all day long, and I'm fine making sure that our kids are safe and nurtured and cared for, and they're mindful and self-aware and making responsible decisions at school. But how do we bridge that connection from what they're practicing in school to the home life?
Yeah.
Because I feel like a lot of my students miss that. Like as soon as they check out of school, they're done.
Yeah. Has anyone had success? Yeah.
So I teach kindergarten in central New York, and yeah, you can clap.
And I've really been focusing on mindfulness for the past 2 years. And I didn't really focus on the parents. The kids are focusing on the parents. They're bringing lessons home and showing their parents how to be mindful. It's amazing. And it's rewarding too. So I have found that parents are now asking me questions to say, what's this like finger tracing thing that you're doing? My child did this when they were in a moment at home. And I'm noticing that it's helping. So
Yeah.
it's great.
That's great. Anyone else have strategies that they've used to connect parents to the good work happening?
Well, I wanted to do it with all the grades, but I only did it with kindergarten. Is every month in the teacher's newsletter, we just put what we did for SEL that month, like a little strategy. But I think we can incorporate a mindfulness strategy with that.
Yeah, yeah. Definitely. Anyone else? Yes.
I have a school in Yorkville, and we actually have the parents on Facebook groups, like individual private Facebook groups. So throughout the day, we'll post pictures or talk daily about what we're doing so that they can practice it at home as well.
That's great. A lot of different ways to communicate what's happening. And so we have a lot of resources at CASEL.org for reaching families, but they're more SEL specifically focused, but I wonder if they could either be something you could use and adapt, or just they could maybe help you sort of have your plan for doing that. Anyone else? Yes?
I have more of a question for you and those of you that use these strategies. So you talked a little bit about, I can see it, how the teacher is doing a better job regulating their own things going on, that the students are responding to that. So when you talked about in your career, you started doing these practices, did you see a difference in their behavior based on how they responded to you?
Yeah.
I guess it makes sense.
Yeah.
I was curious, somebody using it, kids seem to be all over.
Yeah.
Maybe focus on that, but was it a response to what you did or the strategies the students were doing?
Yeah, that's a great question.
So I'm not a teacher anymore, but when I was a teacher, I taught middle school ESL continuing students. And one particular student really struck a chord with me because he had a behavior plan and it said, let him throw up in your classroom and just keep teaching. And I was like, what? You want me to let this child vomit? But in that, I was starting to learn mindfulness and emotional regulation. And so I would have my students every morning or every time we had a class. So they weren't with me all day. Sometimes if they didn't tolerate, they would go out to gen ed classrooms. But I would ask them to identify on a scale of 1 to 5 what emotion they were feeling. So 5 being I'm out of control, there's an emergency, I need help. 1 being I'm very calm. This particular student was checking in a 5 every single day. And I started doing a 30-second body scan or a 30-second concentration or a relaxation mindfulness script with them. And over time, it was just anecdotal data because the student was reporting, and you can't really, that's how they were feeling in the moment, but that's their feeling, so you can't really quantify that. But they didn't know that I was tracking that data, and he started checking in at a 3 and a 2, and over time, through those mindfulness meditations at the beginning of classes, I started to see decreasing emotional responses from him, and he stopped throwing up.
Wow.
So, that's one really extreme case. I did see, the rest of my class calm down a lot, and they weren't wanting through school being crazy, which is what ended them up in my classroom. So, anecdotally, I've seen it with a small group of students.
A response to this? Yes.
Hi everyone. My name is Kayo and I'm a school psychologist with Large Public Schools, so Large Urban School District. I'm no longer in that position. I'm in a more district-wide level working on SEL, mindfulness, and restorative practices. But when I was in the school, when I first heard about mindfulness, I was very skeptical of how this could impact students until I forced myself to try with one of my mandated services child who had a lot of emotional and behavioral issues in the schools at home, where he had wraparound services from the community as well, on top of school-based services. So one thing that we did when he came into my office was just to try out mindful listening. Basic, name time, take a deep breath, just kind of walk him through that. And we did this for maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3 months. And one day he arrived at my office, super angry, looked like he was gonna get into a fight. The first words out of his mouth to me was, "I wanna do that chime thing." And I was like, yes, look at this. We went from where he had no idea how his body was doing, how he was feeling or in response to emotions or problems, to all of a sudden he started recognizing that I am feeling dysregulated and how do I get myself back? And this is one tool that we have worked on for days and months, and he recognized that. And that to me is so powerful, more than any kind of assessment or data that we have for our students to say, I could do that. So that's just one student. And I have to say for the rest of the year, he was not a significant improvement, but we were there.
Yeah, thank you.
The next session starts in like 8 minutes.
Okay, we will wrap up. Go ahead.
I just want to say I think we can make a big difference in staff. I'm an elementary district. We're blessed to have early release every Wednesday to have teacher meetings. But at the end of the day, at 2:30, people aren't always in the best place to have constructive meetings. So we're exhausted. But starting with mindful, we implemented a mindful practice, and everyone just calms down and they're ready to be present and ready to address some of these challenges we're concerned about.
Thank you. Yes. Okay, so I am going to just zip through. I think your voices are more important than this slide. It's just 2 programs that are working on mindfulness. And I think you'll have access to this deck. So just my closing quote, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. Thank you so much for sharing. And this deck also has links to a lot of our resources. So thank you.